So, ladies and gentlemen, today on Sports File, this is a quick request. I saw my good friend Bo Sheaves in Woodstock today, and Bo is a great hockey fan. Like many of the people that have been my readers throughout the years, and I always listen to suggestions from different people as to for podcasts. Now, Bo is a big fan of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s NHL, and he said, I've been really listening to your podcast lately. You got to do something on Bobby Clarke. And I was thinking about it, and as a Montreal Canes fan, I got a lot of sympathy and respect for Bobby Clarke. Sympathy because, as a fellow diabetic, he's type 1 diabetic, he's overachieved in his career because of health concerns and other things, and because Montreal had Clarke on their watch list many years ago when he first entered the NHL. See, he comes under the three G's. He's great, he's gritty, and he was a goon because there's no way to describe his style. He was great on the offense. He was gritty on the offense and defense, but when the time came to be aggressive and dominate the play, especially in 1972 when he broke Harlamov's ankle on a prescribed hit from John Ferguson, who said, Bobby, why don't you go, break his ankle or something? That's how he played hockey back then. So we're going to talk just about Bobby Clarke's playing career because his management career has been very impressive. Now, Bobby Clarke is probably best known as being probably one of the best captains in NHL history. Not only one of the best players in Flyers history, not too many compare. He is one of the best captains up there with the Richards, with Esposito, with Bob Gainey, with like a guy with combined scoring and leadership. Now, Robert Earl Clarke was born on August 13th, 1949. He's going to have his 70th birthday this year. And he played all of his 15 years with the Flyers. Now, according to the Hockey News list of the top NHL players of all time in '98, he was considered one of the best players in history, and he's always ranked in the top 25. There's some change now. He's moved up, and some years he moves down, but he's a top 25 player. Now, despite the fact Clarke only had 300-point seasons and twice leading the league in assists, he wasn't. Every point he had was important, and he played in get this 8 All-Star NHL games. He won the Selke Trophy as well in '83 as the league's best defensive forward. Now, when he retired after the '83-'84 season, he ended up with 1,210 points in 1,144 career games with 358 goals and 852 assists. Now, over the last quarter century, obviously, has been mostly a GM with the Flyers, with time in Minnesota and Florida. But again, we're going to look at his many reasons why his toothless grin was shown quite often over the years. Now, he was born in a small northern Manitoban mining town of Flin, Flon. And Flin Flon is very unique. Not only is a hockey hotbed, it's named after a mythical book character that actually was profiled in one of those great Canadian heritage moments. Now, he began playing organized hockey when he was 8, and he showed great promise, but around ages 12 or 13, he became a little bit sick on a regular basis, and he learned quickly he had type 1 diabetes. Now, a diagnosis of that in the 1960s sometimes meant a death sentence and or a limit on what he can do. He was a highly touted prospect, playing for the junior team, the Flin Flon Bombers. And some people feared, coming out of junior hockey, he wouldn't be healthy enough to be drafted by an NHL player. But Bombers coach Pat Janelle took Clarke to Mayo Clinic in Minnesota following the season. And the doctors there concluded that as long as he watched himself like most diabetics, like Bobby and myself do, he could play professionally. Janelle was very smart. He asked the doctors to write down a statement to that effect. And when the scouts came along to watch the Bombers play, Janelle said, "Hey, he can play." Now this was the '68-'79 season. He would have easily been a number one draft pick, but back then diabetes was still there was a stigma as to type 1 especially, and type 2. It was the diagnosis was tough as well. But even with the assurance, he fell to the second round of his '69 amateur draft when he was finally selected by the Flyers, 17 overall. Now, when Jerry Melnick, who was a scout and administrative assistant with the Flyers, initially tried to tell the Flyers' great management member Bob Poyle to draft Clarke with their first round pick. That fell out. He drafted a player actually very close to my own name, somebody called Bob Courier, who only never played a game in the NHL. And Melnick again backed up the doctor's diagnosis, and another doctor said, he could be fine to play. Now, Poyle was finally convinced to take Clarke in the second round. And get this, the Red Wings and the Canadians had Clarke under draft, what I call I. They weren't going to take Bobby Clarke with their first round pick. There was a lot of good players in the draft. And they immediately offered, the Red Wings and Canadians offered a deal to the Flyers for Clarke. Detroit offered 2 veteran players, and rumor has it was Alex Delvecchio in the deal, but that's just rumor. And Montreal offered a deal that the Flyers management could hardly refuse. There was rumors years ago that it might have been, if I'm not mistaken, either a combination of Rogashev Asho and J.C. Tremblay, or one of the lower defensemen like a Teddy Harris, but it never panned out. The Flyers, like most expansion teams at the time, would rarely trade because we saw later on with Lafleur deal there was there could be a big scam going on where talented players were traded for cracked up veterans. Now he wore that now famous number 16 for his first game. Made his NHL debut on October 11th, 1969 against the Minnesota North Stars, and got his first point to 22nd against actually the Flyers' soon-to-be longtime rivals, the Toronto Maple Leafs, when he assisted on Lou Morrison's third period goal. He scored his first goal on October 30 against the Rangers, another one of the Flyers' great rivals, beating veteran goalie Ed Jacquemin 16-36 in the third period. That year he played all 76 games, was one of the best rookies of the year, recorded 15 goals and 31 assists, and made it to the All-Star game, of course. He was named NHL Rookie of the Year by the Sporting News and finished fourth in voting for the Calder. A lot of people believe Clarke should have won the Calder that year, but the Sporting News saw a better vote total for him than that. Now, second year with the Flyers, he led the team in scoring with 27 goals and 36 assists in 77 games. The Flyers made the playoffs that year, but of course, when any young expansion team with young players, they could have trouble in the playoffs, and he lost in 4 games to the Blackhawks. But at the time, the Flyers weren't considered the pure Broad Street Bullies that later went on to Stanley Cups. They were mostly what he called the Western Conference rivals, where they left so much of the ire with. The Flyers were starting to grow a combination of scoring and grittiness, and yes, fighting prowess, because it was a time where the NHL was changing from a highly skilled league, but a very, very straightforward 12-team league to what was later called the Goon era, because a lot of when the league expansion, the third and fourth lines had a lot of players that really maybe didn't deserve to be in the NHL, other than the original 6 and the other top flight team like the Blues. Now, 71-72 season, his diabetes kind of kicked in a little bit because he had a tooth abscess at the start of the season, and he started the year 20 pounds underweight, and he only had 5 goals and 11 assists, 31 games in the season. Now, over the last 47 games, he really came on. He scored 30 goals and 35 assists and became that point-a-game or 2-point-a-game phenom we really knew him to be later on. That year, he won the Bill Masterton Trophy, and the Flyers re-signed him to a 5-year contract worth $500,000, which was almost like a 400% raise. Now, here's where the change came with Clarke. Clarke was selected for the 1972 Team Canada against the Russians in the Summit Series. He was one of the last key role players selected. He was put on a line with Henderson and Ellis. Ron Ellis, the defensive specialist, and Henderson also kind of the goal defensive specialist in the Maple Leafs. And Clarke came into his own in that series. If anything, Team Canada may not have won without Barbara Clarke, because his grittiness, especially in Russia, he wasn't scared of anybody. The Russians didn't know what to do with him, because he would not do enough to instigate in a fight, but he was like a mosquito. He was always at the Russians. Now, in that series, the very famous John Ferguson thing, because Harlamov was considered one of the best elite players in the league, and the other players, especially older players on the team, really couldn't keep up with him. And Bobby Clarke who basically was not scared to take the goon effort. Ferguson said, encouraged him to say, listen, you got to take him out of the game. And allegedly he broke his ankle or cracked it, and for the rest of the series he was pretty well ineffective. But he got a lot of crap from Canadian, especially Russian media, saying that Flyer had the Flyer mentality or Clarke mentality had no right to take the Russians. But this was hockey wars back then. It was a different world. 47 years ago, the Russians had nuclear weapons pointed at Canada, the United States, and we were there in Canada. Canada was over there in Russia, in a foreign land, trying to defend, the capital system and the West. And all they had was their hockey sticks. They weren't going to shoot the Russians. And you look at Frank and Peter Mahovlich losing their mind, Gary Bergman, Esposito, Parise, Clarke. To them, it was basically war. This was not hockey. This was war. And Bobby Clarke was a soldier. If he would be like a corporal that said, if you want to shoot that guy down, you got to kill him the next hill. Bobby said, you want a headshot or a body shot? That's just the way he was. Bobby Clarke was there to win. He wasn't there to pity pat and, good Russian, way to score that goal. He was going to whack the Russians. And a lot of people, again, the big line, we were white magic and they were black magic. And Bobby Clarke's type of black magic against the Russians helped us win. I mean, we couldn't have won game 6. We couldn't have won game 7 or game 8. Bobby Clarke was technically the pound for pound MVP for the team that year. But when he came out of the Summit Series, Clarke was named the captain of the Flyers at age 23. And he was the youngest to ever assume that role in NHL history up until that time. Before, Connor McDavid's been younger, but that was it. Now, the Flyers were recalled the Broad Street Bullies at the time. He also became the first player from the expansion team to score more than 100 points in a season, at 104 points with 37 goals and 67 assists. Now, the big problem in the playoffs, he got a stick injury in the playoffs against Minnesota in the first round. He scratched his cornea where his contact lenses actually were smashed. He did win the first round series, but the 72-73 year, they had the famous series against the Montreal Canes in the semifinals, losing in 5 games, but you could tell the Flyers were coming on. Now, Clarke was named MVP of the league that year, and the Lester B. Pearson Award as the most outstanding player as voted by the players. Now, in the 73-74 season, his production went down, but the quality of his play improved. Now, his leadership and Barney Perron's goaltending led Flyers to the second best record in the league, and went as far as the Stanley Cup Flyers that played the then number 1 team that year, the Boston Bruins. Now, after losing game 1, Clarke scored a tremendous overtime goal in game 2 on a rebound shot against Gilles Gilbert, who was always snake bitten in the playoff. The Flyers won the next 4 games, and again became the first expansion team to win the Stanley Cup. Now, according to CompuStats that year, he won 48 of 67 face-offs against Phil Esposito, and he also, his play in Schultz and everybody else, neutralized Bobby Orr by chasing him down to stick and grab. Now, the Stanley Cup goal in Game 6 was scored after a fight, actually, that put Clarke and Orr into a penalty box. And it was a big series. Boston had the better team, but the Flyers basically could beat you up, could score, could hit you. They could do anything. Now, in 74-75, he won their second straight cup. In that year, he broke the record for most assists by a the centerman with 89, getting 116 points. Finished second in the league scoring, actually with a plus-minus rating of plus 79, if you can imagine. And that was the year when Barney Perron was very, very effective. They were very good on the road, very good at home. He made it all the way again to the finals and defeated the Buffalo Sabres in 6 games, where a lot of people was expecting Montreal to advance against Buffalo in the semifinals. But Buffalo won in 6 games, despite the fact Montreal outplayed them in games 3 and 4 at home. Now, in that year, Clarke was again awarded his 3rd Hart Trophy and named to the first Star All-Star team for the NHL. But over the next few seasons, after obviously Flyers lost in 76 to Montreal in the finals, his production went off, and you could see gradually maybe he had won too much and he felt maybe satiated. But they remain contenders as well, because they reached the semifinals in 77 and 78, reached the finals in 1980 but lost in the Islanders. And after the quarterfinal loss in the Rangers, he became assistant coach for the Flyers. Now, gave him captaincy for a while in the NHL rules. Bridgman took over, like Mel Bridgman was captain. And in 1980, they had one of the longest the undefeated streaks in sports history, but the longest one in NHL history up until this time. 35 games, and they were Pete Peters and everybody else were. It was a great year for the Flyers, but he lost in 6 games to the Islanders, a team that had more skill and grit, and that really paid off for them. Now, Clarke's later seasons with Philadelphia, ended up leading to his 1,000 career point. And he overcame his type 1 diabetes and hard-nosed play because he would take minuscule injuries every game, but he was extremely durable. He broke his foot in the 81-82 season, but he still played in 62 games. He would always give 70 to 80 games in every season. But when he gave up the assistant coach in 1982-83, he became captain again. He skated his 1,000 career game in 1982 against the Penguins. And in that season, actually, was his best year in quite a while, with 84 points in 80 games. Now, he retired for one main reason. He wasn't done as a player, but he wanted to get into management. And on May 15, 1984, he became the official general manager of the Flyers to lead the team into, not say championship success, but Final Four and Final Two success. But on a personal level, I've never met Bobby Clarke. But with Bobby Clarke, he's not scared to say his mind. A lot of the major coaches that have influenced my writing style or, quotes and stuff like that, the best ones had aspects of Bobby Clarke about them. Not only he was very, very determined, he was very direct. He wasn't scared to say what you see is what you get. But I go back to 1972, again, you had to live through it. 47 years ago, with all the craziness now about Yellow Jackets and Trudeau and NSCC, Lavalin, Canada as a country was more united back then by sports than it was politics, because Trudeau, he was in, but we didn't think politics was important as sports. You got to understand, this was the heyday of the Montreal Expos, Team Canada, Montreal Canadiens, Toronto Maple Leafs, Vancouver Canucks, Boston Bruins, who had a lot of Canadian players. You had from place to place. We know every player in the NHL. We didn't know half the cabinet that Trudeau had that year. Hockey was king, and if there was somebody that was the soldier, the general of Team Canada, Esposito was the 5-star, but Bobby Clarke was the 4-star general. He was the guy that was willing to go in the corners against the Russians, to not take any craziness from the linesmen, from the referees, Bada and Kampala. He was willing to win. He took that expertise from 72, he applied that to the Flyers. There's no way the Flyers would have won the Cup. And Reggie Leach told me this. I missed Reggie Leach. He said there was no way the Flyers could have won the Cup without Bobby Clarke. He was the glue that kept everything together. As a Montreal fan, I always had to respect the Flyers because they were battlers. I mean, there were more than just Mad Dog and Dupont and Schultz and Selesky and Dornhofer and Lonsbury. They were a gritty team, and you can't just win on fighting alone. You got to score goals, and he could score goals. There was only one team that he couldn't really intimidate. It was the Montreal Canadiens. I know Boston was intimidated because I watched those games, and the Rangers were just beaten up. Boston was intimidated not because they could be outfought, but because they couldn't be outmaneuvered or outgritted like grinders. The term grinders only came along with the Flyers, because before that there was so much natural skill in the NHL. Before it expanded, there was no need, for the grinders. So I know for a fact there's many, many members of my family and my colleagues and friends that are big fans of Bobby Clarke, and why not? Would I encourage a young player to play like Bobby Clarke? I don't think anybody could play like Bobby Clarke. He was a complex individual, still is. He basically looks at hockey as religion, hockey as war, hockey as money, hockey as player development, hockey as intimidation, hockey as promotion. He is probably one of the most complex. You think Don Cherry is complex, the way Bobby Clarke has spoke his mind about Roger Nielsen and Cherry and Lindros and the Canadians and the international hockey and everything else. I don't think he had anything good to say. If he had anything bad to say, he'd say it. If anything good to say, he'd say it. He wasn't scared to say it. My God, this guy survived type 1 diabetes. You're battling for your life every day. Can you imagine burning 1,500 to 2,000 calories in a day to play? And you got to balance your blood sugar. There was no meters like now. It was all like, needles that have to be boiled and sterilized. There was no Insta pens now. Mentally, he's one of the most strongest athletes in world history because, he overachieved so much. Bobby Clarke had 50 cents of talent and made that to $1 million because he worked hard on it. He was surrounded by some of the best coaches in American hockey history in the Philadelphia system, some of the best young players, some of the best natural goal scorers that they had. Barber, McClish, Reggie Leach, of course. Reggie Leach did nothing with the Seals. As soon as he got to the Flyers, he became a great player. Now, if times would have changed, I don't think Clarke would have thrived in the Montreal or Detroit system. I think it was a good fit in Philadelphia because you could build a building blocks. Terry Crisp said it best, the former Stanley Cup coach with the Calgary Flames. The Flyers were a team of destiny. There was no way that could be stopped. The fans, Kate Smith, everything. For that 2.5 to 3 years, they were one of the best sports teams in the world. And you got to understand the mid-'70s. You had the Oakland A's. You had technically the Yankees, the Cincinnati Reds, Dallas Cowboys, Miami Dolphins. They were top 5 in the world genre for sports. And you had fans of all ages. And a lot of people that didn't want to take up for the Bruins, the Canadians, or the Leafs because their parents did, they latched on to the Flyers. They were kind of, not say the first disco team, but they were the first team that really embraced that gritty junior hockey style into the NHL. Now, for me, I think Bobby Clarke is for what he did, he's a top 20 player of all time. Yes, other players have more points. The Oilers are the only comparable team because they had skill and fighters at the same time. And it's kind of funny when you look at it. Terry Crisp coaching the Calgary Flames. Calgary made Edmonton a better team. There are 3 teams that made the Flyers a better team because they were chasing the Habs. They caught them, and then the Habs got better. They were chasing the Rangers, and they were chasing the Sabres. Because at the time, Buffalo, Boston, Montreal, the Flyers, even Chicago, there was a big elite. There was a big top 5, and everybody else were just pretenders. This was well before the Islanders and the Penguins and all that. So if you're listening to this podcast, you're a Flyer fan, I'm not saying you should bypass all the great success of the Flyers since he's left, but I'm telling you something. When that Saturday night game would come on with Clarke against Montreal, Clarke against Vancouver, Clarke against Brian Glennie and the rest of the Leafs, it was war, man. And you got every aspect of that Canadian, let's have a fight, let's have a hit, let's have a goal, let's celebrate. It was almost like beer league, like the Quebec Senior League in one team. The team itself were almost like a Bobby Clarke was split off and made into clones. Each of the player in the Flyers had a little bit of Bobby Clarke, if that makes any sense. Because you look at that lineup and everybody is kind of got a touch of Bobby Clarke. Even the guys like Jack Markle and Goodenough and Ben Wilson and players like that. I mean, Bob Daly. It was weird. I watched the game, and not every Montreal Canadian looked like Jean Beliveau or Jacques Lemaire or Guy Lafleur. You look at the Flyers, it was like, hey, this is a whole bunch of Bobby Clarkes playing. So, now, before I leave you go, again, I take requests all the time. If you want to message me, you have any requests, leave a comment, a like, or subscribe. We're nearly coming to 20,000 page views on 100,000 impressions, which means 20% of the people have kind of considered my podcast, have gone on, and I thank you. There are no ads in my podcast. It's not paid by anybody else. This is an expansion of my 36-year career as a journalist, of my columns, sports files, screenshots, remote control, pulp tales, NHL history, I'm calling this now. And if you don't like something, let me know. But if you don't really like me or like what I'm doing, keep it to yourself. Like I said, my old friend the Bayview Drive-In said, if you like me, like the show, tell your friends. If you didn't like it, don't tell nobody. That goes from there. And the people that don't like my podcast, well, you can stick it because I'm 53 years old and I don't know anything to anybody besides myself. Have a good day. Keep your stick in the ice. Bye.